All right, this is chapter 3, part 5. And now let's talk about longitudinal design. Longitudinal design is really very much very similar to the cross-sectional design, with collecting large number of data on a large number of cases, and doing correlational research based on that data, using surveys, questionnaires, all that stuff with cross-sectional. It's usually done in a similar way. Where it's different is that we see here survey of the same sample that is repeated on more than one occasion over time. So it's basically having the sample of people, asking a bunch of questions, and then doing it again in the future, maybe 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, multiple times afterwards. And so it's typically used to map change in social research. So again, if the virtue of asking these questions over time, several times, because you can see how people change over time. So on the first time, they usually call, each time you ask these questions, they call that like a wave. Wave 1, wave 2, wave 3, wave 4. So on the first wave, you might ask a question like, in the past 12 months, how often have you done this delinquent behavior, for example? How many times in the past year did you steal something that was worth more than $50, just as an example? And let's say the person said, oh, I did that like 2 times in the past year. And then you come back a year later and you ask them the same question, how many times did you steal in the past year? And this will be after that first wave, the year after that. And they might say 0. So you can see that they changed, they dropped. They went from doing it 2 times the year before to this past year only doing it 0 times. And so you can say, well, how come they changed? Why'd they stop? What happened? And you can look at factors, other questions, and look for those correlations, those patterns of association, to see if something caused that person to stop stealing, right? And so maybe they stopped hanging out with their delinquent friends who had a bad influence on them. So they dropped those friends in the past year and they stayed out of trouble. Who knows? But you could look at that. You could look and see if they asked questions about who their friends were and see if their friends changed over that period of time. So it's good for studying change as opposed to cross-sectional design, which only looks at one point in time. Now, there's 2 different types of commonly done longitudinal designs: the panel study and the cohort study. And it's important to understand those 2 and the difference between the 2 of them. What you do with the panel study is I select a sample. Let's say I get 100 kids to take my survey, and then I want to interview those same kids like a year from now, and then again 2 years from now. So a panel is the same group of people that you interview multiple times, and you try not to lose track of them. You try to hold on to them, keep their information, their contact information, so you can get a hold of them and ask them those questions again and multiple times. So that's what they mean by panel, is that it's the same group of people. Now, cohort study is similar, but there's an important difference. Typically what you see with a cohort study is these are kind of expensive studies. You don't see them quite as much, but they're great studies. And what they'll do is they'll include every kid that was born a certain year in like a city, say Philadelphia. Every kid that was born, they'll track them down. They'll collect information on them, ask their parents questions. Of course, you can't ask the babies. Ask the parents questions, collect data on them, and then follow those kids as they get older and mature and see how things change and develop. So a cohort refers to this group of, typically, a lot of times they'll start with newborns. It doesn't have to be that, but you're following them over time, but they're like from the same cohort, the same, like you born the same year, that kind of thing. What else did I want to say about that? Oh, that you don't need to. A lot of these PowerPoint notes that I use have a lot of examples from the textbook, and quite a few of these examples are like British examples, examples from England and Great Britain, etc. Because this textbook is published from, it's an Oxford University Press, and so I wish it had more American examples instead of, it tends to give these English examples. So don't stress about any of these examples that they talk about either in the PowerPoint notes or in the textbook, because I tend to avoid those because I want to keep it a little bit closer to home here, focusing on the United States. So usually if specific studies are important or specific surveys or something like that, I usually will talk about it in the lectures. Otherwise, don't worry about it too much, because I'm not concerned that you learn a lot about what's going on over in England. Anyway, so they do, I will say this one thing, that in this final point that they're saying is that another type of study that they're saying really shouldn't be thought of as longitudinal is the type of study that, I'll use an American example. It's called the General Social Survey, and it's done every 2 years. And they will contact a couple thousand Americans, in a sort of random way, and ask them a bunch of questions. And then they come back a couple years later and will ask similar, not exactly all the same questions, but a lot of the same questions, but they'll get a brand new sample of people. They won't go back to those people that they interviewed 2 years ago. They'll get a fresh sample of completely new people. And so that's not a panel study or a cohort study. That's like a cross-sectional study that you are doing multiple years, right? Because it's different people every time. So it's a little bit of a different thing. You could think of it as longitudinal in a way, but if we stick with the textbook here, they're saying, well, that's not really longitudinal. That's like a cross-sectional design, but you're just kind of doing it repeated with different people every time, so it's kind of a different thing. Anyway, you should be aware of that. That's a pretty common way to do studies, is come up with a different sample of people, different group of people every time that you do it. Now, so this is just showing that you're asking the question multiple times, and so we don't need to spend any time on that. So if I say, oh, how old are you? And you tell me that you're 19, and then we get together next year, and I say, how old are you? And you say 20. Well, okay, that makes sense. And so you're asking the same question again and again, and you'll have multiple answers for one person. One person will have several answers because we ask them several times over the years for each different wave, as they call it, right? So that's all they're trying to show here. I don't know how clear that is, but that's the main thing you need to understand about longitudinal, is that we will ask the same questions and see where you're at different periods of time. Now, one thing you have to worry about longitudinal research is this term attrition. Longitudinal, we already talked about a strength of longitudinal research, that it helps you to study change, how people change over time. And that can be pretty powerful. That when you can study change over time, that will help you figure out what's causing what, because you're able to see what happened first, right? Did you drop your delinquent friends first in the first wave, or say maybe between the first wave and the second wave, you dropped your friends, and then you noticed at the same time that you stop stealing. So you can kind of, if you can tell which happens first, then that will help you figure out what's causing what. So longitudinal research is better than cross-sectional for figuring out what's causing what, but it's still not as good as experimental method. We can talk more about that later, but again, I'm just trying to lay out some basic pros and cons. A con of longitudinal is attrition, because what they mean by attrition is that you tend to lose people over time as you do wave 1, wave 2, wave 3, wave 4. Some people disappear. They move, you lose their contact information, you can't get a hold of them. Or they could even, if you're studying, sometimes people could even die or something. So there's various ways you could lose people. So that's what attrition refers to, is the loss of people over time. And so you may have started out with 100 the first time you did the study, or wave 1, and maybe by wave 4 you're down to 75 people. And now you've lost all the information on 25% of your sample. And so is that going to screw up your results because you've lost a lot of people? So that's a problem with longitudinal research. With cross-sectional research, it's just a one-shot deal. You don't have to worry about people after that short period of time for the one-time deal. But longitudinal research, you got to keep track of people. That's harder to do. Okay, now there's some other things. I don't want to get into, again, a lot of details. We'll be talking more about these in the future, so I'm going to skip over some of this. Case study design. This is very different and has its own pluses and minuses. By case study, we typically mean one case. So you're going to study one, say, person very, very carefully, probably over time, intensively, spending a lot of time with this person, collecting a lot of information, doing a lot of interviews. So it's in depth. And these tend to be qualitative, where you're not focusing on numbers. You tend to be focusing on sort of words, information, the big picture. You want to get rich, deep information about this one person, because you think that by that intensity, by that intense approach, you're really going to be able to learn a lot. So it doesn't have to be one person. It could be one, as we see here in the examples, of one community, one school, one family, one organization. But it's just one. You're not comparing. Typically in research, typically with the scientific method, we're comparing different cases to figure out, well, why is this case different than that one? Why is this kid in a gang and this kid's not? How come this kid ended up in a bad place, this kid ended up in a good place? That's a basic cornerstone of a scientific method, is trying to learn from comparing. Case study takes a different approach because it really wants to focus on one case, and it's useful. What's the strength of that is that it helps you generate theories, because you're going so in depth and spending so much time collecting rich information on one person or one case, that you can learn a lot from that. You get richness, you get depth. But that's a strength. But a weakness is that you don't know if what you're finding applies to anybody else, because you only look at one case. And it's hard to figure out what is causing what, because you don't have any comparisons to make. You can't look at this kid and see what was different about him that got him into a gang compared to that kid who didn't get into a gang. You can't really learn from comparison, but you can come up with some sort of rich theories, like hypotheses about maybe what's going on. So that's where the strength of a case study design is. You get depth, you get richness, and it's also not super time consuming and expensive and difficult, because it's just one case, one person, for example. And so it doesn't have to be it could be a lot of work if you're studying hundreds and hundreds of cases, right? As you can see this term here, that this approach is idiographic, meaning you can learn a lot. Idiographic meaning that you can learn a lot about this one case, but it doesn't necessarily tell you about other cases, because you're not doing comparisons. And what you're learning from this case, it may be unique to that person, unique to that individual, unique to that case. You don't really know if it applies to others. We need large samples to get a better sense if what you're finding applies to everybody. It applies to, as they call it, the whole population of people. So this is limited, and this is a weakness, in that you don't really learn about other cases. You just learn about the one, and that might be of limited usefulness to you. Okay, so now you really understand this person really well, but does that really help you understand anybody else? That's kind of a problem with a single case approach. So it's good for richness, depth, good for generating theories and hypotheses, bad for being able to generalize to other cases, to other people, so that you can get usefulness from this study in applying it to other people's situations, right? So those are some of the strengths and weaknesses of a single case study. I'll just skip over that. I already give some pros and cons. Take a look at what the notes in the textbook have to say about case study research a little bit more. And you have this comparative design, where it's taking it further than this single case study and comparing. Usually it's a fairly small number of cases, could be 2, 3, 5, 10, just a sort of a manageable small number of cases that you're still studying very intensively, in depth, taking a lot of time with a handful of cases. But here you get the advantage of, through comparison, you can learn. Where you often see a comparative design with a small number of cases is, say, a historical sociologist, for example, who's trying to figure out, why do countries have revolutions? Where does that come from? What causes that to happen? And so what you do is you study in depth a handful of countries and look to see the differences in those countries and how the differences might have produced a revolution or might have prevented a revolution from happening. So you see this quite a bit in history, comparing countries. So it's intensive. You have to know the ins and outs of those handful of countries, and it's complicated because countries are complicated. So it could be a really intensive, labor-intensive study, but it's still going to be fairly small in number. It's going to be too much to handle. You're not going to be able to study 100 countries, just a handful in an in-depth way like this. So you often see this, as I say, with comparing countries or cultures. And again, the advantages of this approach are that because you're doing stuff in a very rich, in-depth way, you can get deeper meaning, deeper understanding with spending a lot of time with it. The problem with these cross-sectional designs or longitudinal designs that we're using, surveys, that kind of thing, is it tends to be kind of superficial. You're just asking a handful of questions, takes 10 minutes to do the survey, and might just be scratching the surface. So that's a limitation of survey research, is it can be a little superficial. This is much more in depth and richer, and you can get a fuller picture, more context, more big picture, that kind of thing, with this sort of approach. So that's a positive of both the single case study and also comparative study, is it can be very in-depth and deep and rich, and good for generating theories, explanations, and hypotheses that you can test later on other methods, like the surveys, like experiments, or something like that. So this tends to be good for generating theories. And this comparative design has an advantage over the single case, because of the single case you can't compare. And so it's harder to know exactly what's going on and what's causing what without the differences. You have to look and say, well, if you only study one country and why they had a revolution, single case study, well, it's maybe hard to know exactly, because comparing gives you insight, because you can say, well, this country over here is really similar, but they didn't have a revolution. So how come they didn't and this other country did, when they're really similar countries? And you might be able to tease out that one difference that was crucial for explaining the revolution in the one country. See, so comparison gives you insights and information that you don't have with just a single case. So there's an advantage there with comparative. Of course, it's going to be more time consuming. It's a bigger deal if you do 5 or 6 or 7 instead of 1. So the downside here of comparative would be time consuming, labor intensive, and time is money. So, it's going to be more expensive the bigger the project too. So that's, always pros and cons for the various approaches and perspectives. Okay, so again, you don't need the comparative design. You just have a small number of cases. You're going back and forth. You're collecting a lot of data, comparing between the two. Don't need to spend any more time on this visual. And I've already kind of give you some pros and cons on the comparative design. So again, some of this will come up later in the semester, but I think this is at least got you familiar with these major different approaches, major research designs. And so it's at least a good introduction for that. From this slide, I'm trying to think if there's anything that's important. Just make sure and go over all these. I don't want to belabor the points too much. Make sure you cover this, and of course, read the textbook to get any more in-depth stuff than what I'm doing right now. And that completes the chapter.